It's the last week of February, and you're standing in the seed aisle of a hardware store under fluorescent lights, holding a paper packet the size of a playing card. Inside it, maybe 30 tomato seeds. The packet costs $4.49. You pick up 8 more: beans, squash, peppers, lettuce, cucumber, and by the time you reach the register, you've spent $41 for seeds that will fit in the palm of one hand. Next February, you will do this again, and the February after that. For as long as you garden, you will pay a company for the right to grow food every single year, forever, because the seed in your hand was built on purpose to not be saved. Now picture a farmhouse 40 minutes outside of Middlefield, Ohio. In the back room, on a shelf above the canning jars, there's a row of tin cans, old coffee tins, dented, no labels, just a strip of masking tape and handwriting. Tomato, 1987. Bean, Grandma Esh. That family has not bought a seed packet since Eisenhower was president. Not once. Not for anything. Every plant in their garden this summer will be the great-great-grandchild of a plant that grew in that same dirt before the seed companies existed as we know them. By the end of this video, you will know exactly how they do that. The drying method, the storage trick that keeps a seed alive for over a decade, and the one seed-saving mistake almost every home gardener makes that guarantees their saved seeds won't grow true the following year. I want to be precise about something before we go further, because precision is the whole point of this video. What that family in Geauga County is doing is not nostalgia. It is not a quaint hobby. It is a closed-loop food system that is run, without interruption, for over a century, on a total annual seed budget of $0. And I'm not talking about one lucky family. I'm talking about a documented practice across Amish and Old Order Mennonite communities from Ohio to Pennsylvania to Indiana, one that predates almost every seed company currently operating in North America. The average tomato variety sold in stores today is younger than the seed-saving system that Amish households have used to grow tomatoes for 200 years. Stick with me to the end of this video because I'm going to show you something I only learned about 18 months ago, sitting at a kitchen table with a woman named Miriam Esh, who let me look through what she calls her seed book. A hand-bound ledger going back 4 generations that records not just what was planted, but which specific plant in the row was chosen to save from, and why. I have never seen this method written down in a single seed-saving guide sold in stores, and after this video, you'll understand exactly why it's the difference between seeds that sort of grow and seeds that grow exactly like the parent plant every time. I have to admit something embarrassing. I gardened for almost 15 years before I understood why my saved seeds kept failing me. I'd grow a beautiful heirloom cucumber, save the seeds like the internet told me to, plant them the following spring, and get something strange. Bitter, misshapen, nothing like the parent. I assumed I was doing something wrong with storage. I wasn't. I didn't understand pollination. Nobody had ever explained to me that 2 different squash varieties planted 60 feet apart will cross without you ever knowing it happened, and you won't find out until a year later when you plant the wrong seed and wonder what went sideways. I felt genuinely foolish the day Miriam explained it to me in about 90 seconds, using nothing more than 2 coffee cans and a piece of cheesecloth. 15 years of buying seed packets, and the actual barrier to saving my own had nothing to do with skill. It had to do with information nobody had bothered to hand me. So let's talk about how we got here. Because this isn't an accident of modern convenience. It's the result of a specific piece of legislation most gardeners have never heard of, the Plant Variety Protection Act of 1970. That law, for the first time in American history, allowed seed companies to hold something close to a patent on a living plant variety. Before 1970, saving seed from a store-bought variety and replanting it was simply what farmers did. After 1970, it became, in many cases, a licensing violation. The practical effect over the following decades was a steady replacement of open-pollinated varieties, the kind that grow true from saved seed, with F1 hybrids, which are deliberately bred by crossing 2 different parent lines so that the seed produced by the resulting plant will not reliably reproduce the same plant again. That's not a conspiracy. It's a business model. A hybrid seed sells itself back to you every single year by design, because the seed it produces is genetically unstable. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that a group of executives sat in a room and decided to make American gardeners dependent on an annual purchase out of malice. I don't need to make that claim, and I'm not going to. I'll just lay out two facts side by side. In 1970, roughly 3/4 of the vegetable varieties grown in American home gardens were open-pollinated, seed-savable types. By the early 2000s, that number had reversed almost entirely toward hybrids. You can draw your own conclusion about why. What I can tell you factually is this. The non-profit Seed Savers Exchange was founded in 1975, specifically because its founders watched their own family's heirloom seed varieties start disappearing from the marketplace within a single generation, and realized that if ordinary families didn't save them, no one would. The U.S. government runs its own version of the same insurance policy. A facility in Fort Collins, Colorado, originally called the National Seed Storage Laboratory, built specifically to freeze bank seed varieties before they vanish for good. Norway built an even larger version of the same idea into a mountain on an island near the Arctic Circle in 2008, largely for the same reason. 3 separate institutions, 3 different decades, all built around the same quiet fear, that once a seed line is lost, it does not come back. Amish households never needed any of those institutions. They were already doing in their own kitchens exactly what those vaults were built to protect. Here's where most seed-saving advice online goes wrong, and it's the first thing Miriam corrected me on. Most people save seed from the biggest, prettiest fruit on the plant because that's the one that looks the most impressive. That is exactly backwards. The Amish selection method works on a simple rule. You save seed from the plant, not the fruit. Before harvest even begins, you walk the row and mark, with a strip of cloth or a notch on a stake, the plant that came up earliest, stayed healthiest through the season, resisted whatever blight or pest hit the rest of the row, and produced consistently, not just once, spectacularly. Only after you've identified the best plant do you choose your seed fruit from it, and even then, you take it from the middle of the plant's production, not the very first fruit, and not the very last. This single plant selection process, repeated year after year, does something remarkable. It slowly adapts that variety to your specific soil, your specific microclimate, your specific pest pressure. A tomato line grown this way for 15 years in one particular Ohio garden is no longer just a tomato. It has become, quietly, a locally adapted variety that outperforms anything you could buy from a catalog because it has been optimized, one growing season at a time, for the one plot of ground it's grown in. There's a second layer to selection that Miriam almost mentioned in passing, and I nearly missed how important it was. She doesn't just track which plant to save from. She tracks which years were hard. A drought year, a year with early blight pressure, a year the cutworms came through the bean rows and took out 1/3 of the stand. Seed saved from a plant that pulled through a bad year gets a small mark in the ledger. A tiny cross marks entries for future seasons, giving slight preference to resilient lines developed over generations. This builds resilience in seeds like natural selection, but done purposefully in 4 generations, recorded in a small notebook. Commercial breeding uses recurrent selection with university support and trained geneticists. Miriam operates a home version with a pencil. Cross-pollination is another issue. Squash, cucumbers, corn, and many brassicas can cross with nearby varieties. Insects don't follow garden boundaries. Traditional isolation uses distance. Corn needs up to a 1/4 mile, while self-pollinating crops like beans and peas typically pollinate themselves before blooming. Where distance isn't available, timing and physical barriers become essential. Stagger planting dates to prevent overlapping flowering. Handbag individual flower clusters in cloth or paper before blooming. Use a small paintbrush for hand pollination, then rebag until fruit sets. This method may seem tedious. For a home garden with a few key varieties, it takes about 20 minutes weekly during flowering. Now, if you think this is only for large farms, consider Miriam's garden. It's a typical suburban backyard, under a quarter acre. She maintains 26 seed varieties yearly with help from her 2 children and a full-time household. Isolation and selection methods can be scaled down. However, drying and storage are critical, determining if all efforts were worthwhile. I want to pause and address something crucial. Some hybrid seeds have legal restrictions on saving under the Plant Variety Protection Act. This isn't uncommon. In 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Bowman versus Monsanto Company against a farmer who replanted patented soybean seeds. I tell you this not to scare you. Most seeds you buy are free from such restrictions, like heirloom seeds. It's essential to know that the legal landscape has shifted for saving seeds, an act once simple. Amish households deliberately stay on the open-pollinated side, avoiding legal complications. Here's the key advice from Miriam's seed book. Most storage methods suggest drying seeds and using envelopes, but this often leads to lost viability. Miriam's method involves a 2-stage dry. First, air dry seeds for a week without direct sunlight until they snap. Then place them in a sealed container with a cloth pouch of powdered milk to absorb moisture. This lowers the seed's internal moisture, extending viability. Stored properly, seeds can last much longer than commercially packed ones. Remember, seed saving has risks. Early saved seeds may show variations, especially if prior isolation wasn't practiced in your garden. This is normal. It indicates your garden's genetics are stabilizing, like Miriam's family experienced. If you need uniformity for crops this year, buy hybrid seeds. This system is a long-term investment, not an instant fix. Later, Miriam shared the oldest tin of beans labeled Grandma Esh, which had been preserved for generations. Those beans endured droughts and blight, a legacy of resilience. "A seed company can't sell you that," she said. "You either kept it or you didn't." I reflected on the cost of tomato seeds I'd bought and discarded. It struck me that we often overlook a seed's lifespan. This way of gardening isn't just traditional, it challenges a system designed for someone else's benefit. You're here because you sense the importance of being able to replant your own harvest. I want your feedback. Check your seed stash or recall your last growing season. How many were hybrid versus open-pollinated or heirloom? Be honest. The labels often clarify. If you've struggled with saved seeds, share your experience. I read all comments to identify common issues. If this changes how you'll garden, subscribe. Each subscriber means fewer households rebuying seeds, adding up over time. Next time, I'll discuss Miriam's husband's kernel selection method linked to an old German planting calendar, essential for preserving